Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Simply Complex podcast. My guest today is Evan, the Bioethicist, and today we're going to be talking about information that permeates throughout social media. It's weird how we got into this particular situation. How did we become so polarized? Why has content decreased attention span over time and is favored quantity rather than quality? How has that affected medical information? And how has that given a space for the amount of disinformation all across the internet and social media, excuse me? Now, after this, we talk about how to combat disinformation and how to socialize with people that we've grown distant to. Because at the end of the day, we control the algorithms that feed us the content, not the other way around. So, without further ado, let's get into this conversation. Hey, Evan, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing all right. So tell me about yourself. What do you do?
I am trained and specialized in bioethics. I work in public health, so my specialization or my interest in bioethics usually pertains to public health. And I work in public health as well. Yeah, and that's the crux of what I do professionally.
Gotcha. And with your degree, is your degree bioethics specifically?
Yes. So my degree, I went to a specialized program at Temple University. It's the Lewis Katz School of Medicine. So for a lot of bioethicists, we're trained in med schools. There's other programs in med schools. I love talking about that because a lot of people think you have to be a doctor. You can go to med school for quite a few things. But my program at Temple specifically is called an urban bioethics program, or that's the title that they have. And they specialize in like population specific bioethics. So it's medical ethics, but then the bioethics and what attracted me to the program was how specific they got around things like health equity, vulnerable populations, and also like the differences between geographic locations and like medicine, like medical access or like healthcare access. So like rural spaces, suburban spaces, and urban spaces. So that's just like the fancy. It's the only one of its kind in the country, and I really loved the concept of it, that it wasn't just hyper philosophical.
Gotcha. And what inspired you to pursue it?
I started working, I actually, weirdly enough, I had started off in undergraduate with an American Studies and Civilizations degree, and then I have a minor in Soc. And I thought that I was going to go into governance. I like to say governance and not politics, because when I talk about it, a lot of times people are like, oh, like you wanted to be like a representative. And I'm like, no. I love the bipartisan jobs that exist in governance. I love working for people as a civil servant. I just think it's one of the greatest gifts that you can have. It's I think, one of the best jobs you can have if you're in it for the right reasons. And so I had started working in the mayoral administration, not the current one we live in under Philadelphia now, but the one prior, in their first term. And I was working in the mayor's office. And I had done some other work. Prior to that, I had done a hurricane relief work. So I'd been sort of circling public health for some time. And I finally got moved during COVID over to the health department to work on a project about vulnerable populations. And it just really sparked my interest. And so I went back to school during COVID to like look at these different, I just wanted to become more knowledgeable inside of the area that I had been asked to do work. So working in like government, local government, municipal government, really kind of sparked the interest.
Gotcha. And you have a TikTok account called Evan the Bioethicist, correct?
I do. I do.
Gotcha. So walk me through that.
Um, I think I did what everybody else did. I wish I could say I'm unique, but I'm not. where during the very beginning parts of COVID, when we were like all trapped in the house, we weren't even working. We were all just sitting around waiting for this thing to pass by. I don't know why we thought, in hindsight, I don't know why we thought that was going to happen, but we were all sort of waking up, and the days were getting longer and longer, and we were in the house for like weeks on end with nothing to do. I downloaded TikTok because everybody was on it, and I was really enjoying some of the content I was seeing sort of start to slowly cross over to Instagram. And yeah, I simultaneously started my program, my bioethics program, and I knew immediately what I wanted to major in, or what I wanted to do my thesis on, which was misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories in public health, because I just saw it so much, even before COVID. I mean, there's like a lot of historic precedents. And so TikTok is such a unique platform because it is supercharged in terms of its algorithm, but also in terms of its shareability, right? So like I couldn't go viral on TikTok in a matter of hours, and there's just that doesn't exist on any other platform. And so as I was learning about, and the questions as I was learning about my thesis, I was learning a lot about how people can consume such bad information online. And one of the questions I sort of had to myself was, well, do people like consuming information and they just happen to get the wrong information? The wrong information is very palatable and attractive. And if we gave people the right information, like, are people attracted to that too? Like, do people want to know something, or are people attracted to disinformation specifically? And so I created an account and just was sharing what I learned. And it kind of, now it's out of my control. Now I'm like a full-fledged like macro creator, and it's like wild to me. But it does prove that question a little bit in an anecdotal way, to an extent, that like, yeah, people want the right information. People want to learn things. And social media is the most accessible thing.
Gotcha. And as a bioethicist, are there any necessary definitions or terms that we should know before proceeding?
I always tell people when they ask me, how do I get in, what's like the starting point of bioethics? And I always tell people the starting point is probably the three principles of bioethics. And that is non-maleficence, beneficence, and autonomy, right? These things are these are the three most important things that we say categorically in healthcare, in medicine, when we talk about being a patient, when we talk about receiving care, anything related to health and medicine. We want people to have autonomy. We want people to experience do no harm. That's non-maleficence. And then beneficence is like, we want people to experience good. We want the ultimate result of what you're experiencing in your health and care should be goodness. And the goal of someone who's an ethicist should always be like, how can we make things more good? Now, where I'll give an additional component here is I was trained under a more modern, like a lot of people would say that my bioethics training has a lot of modernity to it. So it's a lot more modernized. And so a more modernized version of this that I ascribed to and was trained under was agency, non-maleficence, and justice. So taking it that next step of like, it's not enough for someone to be autonomous and be able to make decisions. We want patients to actually be collaborators in their health, and we want to consider and talk about them as like not just people who make decisions for themselves, but also as like a full and complete part of the healthcare system. And of course, do no harm, remains the same. And then justice. It's not enough to seek good. Good is sort of subjective. That instead we're seeking justice. And so that becomes, and I can explain it more, like, if you want, but like,
yeah, sure.
Just the reason why it's shifted to justice is because good is in a lot of ways very subjective. And good also means that we have to grapple. A lot of people don't understand the subjectiveness of good. And so justice gives people a more clear and distinct path. So like as a bioethicist, one of the things that like my training requires of me is it requires of me to be critical of law. You know what I mean? Like there have been plenty of instances where harmful, destructive, genocidal, violent, like policy has been law, and has harmed people deeply. And if I'm trying to interpret or understand what's to be perceived as good, um, I could really get a little lost on it, because some people think what is good is following the law, and some people might think what is good is protecting or taking care of people. And so justice is a more centered, like, core principle for us, in the sense of like we're seeking justice for patients, or for the or for vulnerable or marginalized folks. And so um yeah, so that's the what we center, because there's bioethicists who do things like a substantial portion of their expertise is in things like um torture and medicine. And in those cases, good, torturing people to get certain results in research, for example, you could argue that that's good, because we can learn a lot and we could have some really important medical, finds come of it. But is it just? No.
Gotcha. The first thing that came to mind, it seemed like they were lenses to look at certain issues with. So, like when I took a business ethics class, you had here's utilitarianism, here's rights and duties, here's fairness and justice, here's Aristotelian ethics, and these are four ways to argue certain issues or certain business cases that pop up along the way. I'm guessing those three are sort of like those lenses.
Yeah. I mean, we also have the lens. The two that pop up often in bioethics is consequentialism and all groups therein, like utilitarian, egalitarianism. There's all those little breakout groups, and deontology. So those are the two main ones that we ascribe to and we talk about. I am a consequentialist. Most more modern bioethicists are,
Mm-hmm.
especially bioethicists who don't have like a religious affiliation or core construction. There's like religious, there's um, like more like theologian based
Mm-hmm.
ethicists, and I would I've seen them ascribe to being deontologists. I've seen older folks, a lot of older bioethicists really ascribe to being deontologists. It just doesn't fit inside of the modern uh, philosophic constructions as far as I perceive. That I'd prefer to talk about what are the consequences of an action versus what is good, what is not good. Boiling it down to its most simple components, deontologists are having that conversation of like what is good, what is the most good, how do we do good. There's sort of this fixation on goodness and reinterpreting it or understanding it. I, as a consequentialist, it's pretty important to me to know like what happened, what will happen, what can happen, who is harmed, who's involved, who consented. Those are the questions I like to answer.
Gotcha. So consequentialists are more pragmatic, and deontologists would be more like an idealistic lens.
I think so. When I've seen the arguments inside of bioethics, there's plenty of philosophy majors who are going to have a different construction and perspective, but to remember that bioethics is an applied ethics, not
Mm-hmm.
speculative, and it's not philosophy. There's philosophy construction, but the guiding component of ethics is that we're talking about principles, right? We're talking about um, construction of societal agreements. We're talking about accountability measures, and so because of that, that is the easiest like simplification in this niche. It gets way more broken out when you get into like philosophy, but I,
Gotcha.
that's not who that's. I've had those courses. That's not what I practice.
I gotcha. I understand. Philosophy, like a very abstract subject. You can go in any direction at any time.
And it's not always based inside of like realism, right? Like there's philosophic arguments that are great to have as like exercise of thought, but how does that affect things in the now and the today? That's sort of the thing I'm concerned about, because I use it functionally, for work, and professionally. I don't I don't always like end up, or I don't always love ending up in those more philosophic spaces all the time.
Yeah.
It's the weekend. It's for the weekend.
True. I use a lot of different subjects to try to find out how we got here, and philosophy is good for that as well. So why does it seem like our society is so polarized today?
Ooh, I think I mean, looking at it from the lens of someone who has to be sort of chronically online, but also has to straddle the real world too. I think there's a little bit by design, not to be like overly conspiratorial, but like it does benefit um, those any sort of system or people in power for us to be fragmented, right? Um, and so it's why the FBI pitted you know civil rights leaders against each other, or tried to. It's there's whenever you see people trying to organize, especially the proletariat, as it were, or like the pleb class, the populist group, starting to talk to each other. And I think we're living in an era where we can all talk to each other really well. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we have so much access. I right now can like tag anybody across the world that I connect with or I want to connect with on TikTok. I can tweet them on Twitter. I can follow them, on LinkedIn. Like I can connect with so many people, and I think that has a lot. I think that holds a lot of concern for people who are very committed to the way that societies have always run, especially societies that require inequity, and require there to be a wealthy and privileged class and then another group that serves as labor and a wealth building group. Um, so I think there's a little of like, I think there's I don't want to say like intentionality, like it's the Illuminati, but when I say intentionality, I mean like nobody in power is going to lean into a design that threatens their power. And so I think one of the things that has caused a lot of this polarization has been the flattening of information that media has created. And I don't just mean social media, I also mean like our general, like more mainstream or large scale conglomerate media. Um, and that's in two ways. The media, number one, more and more has become collaborative for things like information because they cut back on more tactful and like I want to say like thoughtful research because of a 24-hour news cycle.
Mm-hmm.
But there's actually also the like constant like concentrating of our media, right? That there are like I think it's like at this point three major corporations that have been buying out local media for about the last 2 decades.
Mm.
So if you lived in like some small town, like Marfa, Texas, and there was the Marfa, Texas Times. I'm making something up, but it just is an example. The Marfa, Texas Times used to be an independent group of people who lived in Marfa, who wrote about Marfa's, the concerns of people in Marfa, the city council, what they were passing. And then you would have more, maybe like an investigative journalist piece, maybe once a week, or like on in the Sunday paper or whatever. And it would keep you informed of like larger scale issues out in the world. But now there are these corporations that are, and it's not just like private equity, but there's these media corporations that are sort of absorbing these smaller localized media forms that people trusted because they were local, and buying them out and either obliterating them or turning them into another place to generate um, and mimic just larger scale media. And so more and more people have disseminated their media ingestion across things like social media and corporate media or larger media. But also at the same time, larger media entities are sort of all the same. And that's not like dismissive. That's like actually sort of what's happening on the back end in a lot of ways, business wise.
Hmm. So this oligopoly controls the narrative, and the information that gets pinged out from the top down is all the same.
Right. So like a good example is like a lot of the not people not understanding like exit polling in the recent election or in the past elections going back to 2020 2003 that most of our media companies before 2003, or I'm going to say going back into the 70s and 80s actually, they all had their own research team, like stats team, and those folks would do their own polling. They would do their own like pulling their own, like looking at the raw data and pulling their own conclusions and presenting it to you. So if I looked at NBC or if I looked at CNN or ABC or whoever, I would be getting differing perspectives from differing experts, and I could sort of cross compare and come to my own conclusions. But because of budget cutting in things that I think are so critical for information sharing at these larger media, you know, companies and groups that don't make money. It doesn't make money to pay people to go exit poll at elections. It's not financially beneficial to anybody. These more and more, these media companies have shrunk these teams to the point now where exit polling isn't done individually by all of these different entities. They are now doing what's called a national election pool. So they made a consortium between, like, I think it's like 8 of them, and pool all of their budget money, and they hire a third party to do all their exit polling and then send them the data. And now the people that they have on the reporting desk receive this data and they draw their own conclusions, but they're all looking at the same data. So if I'm looking at an exit poll on CNBC and you're looking at an exit poll on CNN, we're looking at the same base data.
Because they come from like Rasmussen, YouGov, and a couple of others.
It just comes from this one company that they hire as the third party exit polling and then does the voter count. Mm-hmm. So there's these companies now that are third party companies, and this isn't like some big secret. This is they gave a panel at Villanova the other day. Like they're very open about this. The company is called Edison Research, and they receive a contract for 4 years at a time to do exit polling and voter counting for all of these media companies. There's 2 other companies that do this. The youngest one is DHQQ, and then one of the oldest ones is AP Votecast. And Fox News does AP Votecast, and AP obviously does AP Votecast. And this is where it gets kind of weird because AP Votecast is very reputable. Like when Fox News does its exit polling, like it's reputable exit polling because it's AP Votecast is who does it for them. Now, what they do with that and how they present it to their viewers is very skewed, right? But it's not, they don't start with bad data, for example. I want to hate them as much as everybody else can and does, but they start with all the right pieces. It's just then when they move into punditry and pedantry, that like becomes the problem. So, but this, I want to say this like shrinking of like expertise and the shrinking of investment in like our media companies means that we, the consumer who are looking for information, are having like a more narrower perspective that we're receiving. That's more and more becoming just like one big sort of Frankenstein's monster of like the same talking points over and over. I'm trying to remember the name of the corporation that it starts with an S that has been absorbing local news organizations and local TV news too. Like local TV news stations suffer the same thing. And so the question becomes, what does that do to us? It makes us, I think it polarizes us. Because either we fragment and we try to find our information other places because all of this looks the same. And then who do we start to trust? Random people on the internet, like I have expertise in things, but I'm still a random person on the internet. I tell people all the time, I'm a singular person. I should not be your source for all things. So that's the other thing too, I'll say, that I think contributes to it is parasocial relationships with internet personalities.
Yeah. You're just another content creator on somebody's For You page.
Absolutely. And am I trustworthy? I like to think of myself as so, because I try to do the best job I can, learning the most information and condensing it in a way that's still accurate but consumable. But no one's editing me. Like when I make a video on, like, to understand that, like, there's no accountability if I decide to turn my TikTok into like a profit based model where I'm selling you whatever I can because I've developed that trust in me and that loyalty. There is no checks and balances for me. And more, our larger scale media sort of has also diverged from that too. And not because they don't have checks and balances internally necessarily. It's because the 24-hour news cycle requires too quick a turnover where it's just not getting the detail and the, like, I think the care it deserves. And then simultaneously, when you hire a third party entity to do things like your exit polling or your voter count, they're not in control of developing their own raw data set. And so there's just there's just like it's like a little bit of a nesting doll of like, where does the accountability occur in these things? For your creators online, there's none, you know. They're making their own content, they're editing it, maybe they got one friend that they pay to help them, but and then with these larger scale media entities, more and more, it's not that they don't have checks and balances internally, it's that more and more they're trusting people who aren't beholden to the same checks and balances, like gig writers or third party, like, contractors.
As a content creator, you can make many small claims, and even though you're slightly defaming somebody or some institution, you're not going to take the hit. But if somebody like Fox News spreads lies and disinformation, they get hit with the Dominion lawsuit.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes. Yeah.
Has there been a decline in quality of journalism overall?
Yes. And so I love, because I recently read an article and somebody brought up something I read in, gosh, I think it was an older book when I was in college. I think it's the author is Neil Postman, and he writes this book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he writes it in the 90s. I want to say 1996 is when it was published. And so he was mainly talking about the rise of like sort of more biased, like right-leaning or left-leaning leaning media after the fall of the Fairness Doctrine in the 1980s. And he also talks about this phenomena of like, are we becoming too concerned with prioritizing being entertained? And so to connect this to your question, my answer is I think the quality of media has really fallen because more and more it's leaning into what, and mind you, it's a supply and demand scenario a little bit. For a very long time, we've demanded things entertain us to the point where we now demand news entertains us, which is why you have all of these pundit shows, right? You have more people watching Lawrence O'Donnell and it's Rachel Maddow, and even like what's the show that's on like HBO? What's his name? John something.
The first name that comes to mind is Bill Maher.
Bill Maher's a good one. He's more of like sort of like a little bit like The View. Like we've sort of leaned deep into these pundit spaces, which may or may not be people who hold any sort of expertise. And we prefer that for our information consumption. Last week tonight with John Oliver, like,
okay.
And these are like, I'm not naming bad, like, The Daily Show is another example. I'm like using like examples that are ones that like even I like find entertaining and will consume, from time to time. But these shows, they've built their premise on presenting information, sometimes really important information, through like a comedian that's funny. And if that's, there's nothing wrong with like consuming things the way that you might like them. But to consider the fact that more and more we're requiring information to entertain us. And so, what does that do to the quality of information if what we're asking media to do is entertain us? It's going to erode it over time.
Yeah. It's hard to explain certain economic policies through that lens, too, because you need a bunch of context and background information. So I would say that over the years, the headlines would have to adjust to that entertainment incentive for profit.
Right. And there's like a need for shock and awe. Like if it bleeds, it leads. You know, there's these sort of like baseline understandings with journalism that are like you want to lean, especially because there's such a high threshold and it's so hard to make journalism still and media to make it profitable. Right. Number one, we live in a day and age where every corporation is sort of like on an MLM goal setting, which is like they want to have record profits every year into, you know, infinity, which is just not plausible. You know, you can't grow every year and expect that not to kill some people. But also that these media companies are trying to remain profitable. And part of that is adding in things like, again, a 24-hour news cycle. Just in my lifetime alone, media has gone from, there's like regular articles. There was, first of all, no internet. There was no like online presence for media. I mean, for like news and information-based media. They put out a print copy. The print copy was the most popular. People had a subscription or a membership or whatever, and they would get a print copy every day, and there was a limited amount that you could print. So you didn't have to have new articles every 12 hours. You just needed to have, you know, you could have one investigative article, you know, a month or a week or whatever. But now people are on where I can sign into CNN, you know, at 1 a.m., read all the articles. And so I'm sort of expecting if they want me to keep clicking on and being on the platform, which is where profitability comes from, is the ad revenue and the eyes on the material. If I'm not back on that website in 6 hours, it affects the profitability. And so what do? You lean into shock, awe, opinion pieces. You lean into kind of creating issues that aren't really, you know, like in the worst case scenarios, when you think about your sort of like Breitbarts and your like Daily Wires, like you generate concerns or issues in order to keep profitability high. And all of it's entertaining.
Would you say that social media is the catalyst that spiraled these companies out of necessity to compete?
Oh, for sure. Because they have to compete with social media. If you don't, and to note also that you'd have to let go of some of your checks and balances and some of your ethics to keep up with social media. Because going back to my point as like, I'm a single person, I could, if I was unemployed and like, you know, I could post 3, 4, 5, 6, 12 videos a day. I mean, I don't know. I've seen some people really post. I'll say that.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have to go through an editor. It doesn't have to go through anything other than like me using CapCut, right? And then posting it. I can generate content endlessly. And if I'm not generating anything of value, like I'm not doing any research for it, I'm just like, it's vibes, it's me just, I mean, that was the thing is like, I think news media tried to compete with people like Alex Jones on InfoWars. You can't compete with that. And the reason why is because he's making stuff up, you know? He can do 3, 4 hour. I mean, he would just sit and make these shows that were hours and hours and hours long. Rush Limbaugh was the same on talk radio.
Yeah.
And it's just vibes. It's just vibes and thoughts, right? Presented as information, but just vibes and thoughts. how are you supposed to keep up with that? I think it was a mistake to try to compete. Honestly, I don't know what the answer should have been, but because it's happened to us all now. But you can't compete with somebody who's making stuff up. That person's always going to be quicker than you
Yeah.
because it's easy to make stuff up.
It's not just that as well, because people memed him. Alex Jones is a
Mm-hmm.
whole meme, whereas CNN as a company is not going to be memed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, what are the downstream effects of content creators prioritizing virality over accuracy and quantity over quality?
It's the incentivization. One of the things, and I've seen it more recently on some of my more recent videos, is why aren't you viral enough? Like, why aren't you viral more? Or why aren't you? Because I have very high engagement. I don't go viral as much as some other folks do. And that's the other reason why is because I don't make content daily. I don't find myself, that is just not possible or plausible for me. I also don't want to train myself to make content daily by prioritizing posting. I want to prioritize good content over producing content to produce content. And so that means that sometimes like there's a whole day where I'm like, there's nothing to make content about today. And I won't. Um, but it's a strong incentive to prioritize posting, and it's a strong incentive to prioritize things that grab people's attention when they're going through a scroll. The average person, when they're scrolling, spends less than a second on each post, right? I think maybe it gets up to, you can get up to 6 seconds depending. But in order to catch somebody's attention, you're not going to catch somebody's attention with, do you want to learn about the nuanced and very real, construction of your government? No. You're going to be like, this politician called another politician this name, and that when you're prioritizing that viralness, and I unfortunately see it with people on all across a political ideology, is that they're like, one of the things I've been trying to figure out how to write an article on is what I'm calling like dystopian core, like post the election folks who are just sitting and making video after video after video of like, well, I think this is what's going to happen. I think this is how like despotism is going to take over us. I think we have about 3 months before we have to move out of the country. And they tell these like intense, just
people
like,
are going to be thrown in camps.
Yeah. Oh, it's like, yeah. Now this country has survived things like McCarthyism. This is not me trying to minimize people's fears, but this country has survived things like McCarthyism, like the Red Scare hunt. You know what I mean? Like this country has survived, what's it called? Nixon. Yeah, like just the stuff that he was up to beyond like Watergate, and the war on drugs and pop, like these things that were so violent and destructive. And some people didn't survive it. I'm not saying everybody did, but there's still a lot of time before, we don't need to make that kind of content right now. I don't know when, but it's not today. It's not like this week, and people have been making this like really, it's like Margaret Atwood fanfic almost, and it's 10 minutes long, and it's scaring people, and it doesn't hold any value other than to just make people sort of fantasize and catastrophize the times we're living in politically. And I think that's so cruel. I personally think it's very cruel.
It kind of reminds me of doomsday prepping in a way,
a little
because
bit.
at some point a middleman is going to come in and try to push a product on you or push certain services on you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's going to happen in this case, but usually that's what happens. Snake oil salesmen come in and try to fill that void.
Well, it's like the product ends up being you watching all the way through, watching the whole video, because I've watched at least 3 different content creators make video after video after video of like, this is what you should do if ICE comes to your door, and like, and you haven't seen your neighbors, and like you want to stand up to them, and like you want to start like going door to door with your neighbors and seeing which of them you need to start a fund for them to escape the country. And like it is very, I mean, it is so hectic and so visceral. I mean, I even find myself like, because I'm a living creature, these like videos, if you watch them for long enough, and mind you, I'm watching them, I'm consuming them just to sort of get a sense of like how I want to talk about this in like an academic writing. And it's
Yeah.
still creating emotional activation for me. Um, and they're not going to push a product on you. I think what's more like sort of, I think, I think the more like, what's the word? Like more destructive, or the more kind of like hidden and like sneaky element of this is like them making this content. They don't even have to push anything on you, because the going viral is what makes it, what makes it like financially like beneficial.
Yeah.
You know, like if I keep making videos like this back to back to back to back to back, and they get millions of views and they get hundreds of thousands of likes and shares and what have you, I mean, that person, depending on what their RPM is, they are making thousands of dollars scaring you.
Yeah. There's a lot that I want to say about that, but I'll try to get us back above the water in a way. It kind of leads into the next question, though. So, how has misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories promoted mistrust in institutions?
Done it in a number of ways. The first, and I think the most destructive, because I see it even in people who are really like well educated on certain things, and so they have the capacity to know a little bit better, as it were, is it's really made everything, misinformation and disinformation really benefit from things, and conspiracy theories especially benefit from things being good, bad, black, white. Um, and so one of the things I always try to encourage people to think about is, if you find yourself being like there's a good and there's a bad, then what you are probably consuming is not, like it's not good information. Like it's not positive, or it's not effective, or it's not the most informative. Um, and so with that, it's made, it creates a lot of policing, number one. But number two, it also means that there's no yes and when it comes to governance and when it comes to democracy, as someone who has a background in civilizations and American studies, and has worked in, you know, municipal government, um, it's not as simple as like my representatives are bad and they're all plotting against me, or my representatives are good, or my representative is a good person who's like been bought and paid for because they've started to change their behaviors on things, or they've started to change their stance on things. And it's like, these are all people, and people are complex, even the ones you don't like. And that doesn't mean that your government is all bad and that the system of governance is bad. I think that I constantly have to challenge people on that. Is like, I had a video where I talked about the fact that like Nixon was inherently a very destructive president. We have policies in health and medicine that are super important and have saved lives, because in during Nixon's era, he put in things like ESRD, which is like, you know, emergency like renal, I don't know, I forget what ESRD stands for all the time. Dialysis is the, essentially it's a free dialysis access for everybody, right? So if you need dialysis, because chronic kidney disease is such a outstanding problem in the course of people's lives, dialysis is essentially a socialist model. We spend 6% of the CMS budget on dialysis for people. And that's a good thing that people have access to dialysis. Richard Nixon did that. Like, so but it's boring to talk about governance in that way. And it's not, you know, it's not as exciting. It's not as like main character YA novel to be like, oh, like our government covers the cost of like HIV meds for people. And that money was expanded under certain presidents and reduced under other presidents, and presidents we've liked have reduced it, and presidents we haven't liked have expanded it. And like, what, you know,
Yeah. I think
but it's that sort of thing that it flattens, and that makes people not trust your government. And like, I'm not telling you to like just everything the government says like drink it down, but I'm also saying like understand it more.
I think that the lens has gotten distorted because people focus on what's going on globally or nationally, and then they have like a top down thinking where it's like, oh, this happened on a national scale, on a federal scale, so my local politician is to blame, even though they're operating in a completely different environment. And especially when you have that D or R in front of their name,
Yeah.
that's gonna compound that impact.
And so it's done a lot of that. If you talk to people who have worked in the non, and I think the other thing too is people don't realize that most people who work in government, this is across municipal, state, federal levels. Most people working in a government are nonpartisan. They are working for you as a civil servant. They are not super consumed with the politicians. Um, like, I mean, I think like Dr. Fauci is such a great example because he's like 80 years old and he worked in HIV prior to even becoming like a civil servant, and he's worked under like 3 or 4 administrations. Like, he is not relational to those administrations. He's a doctor who works on communicable disease, an infectious disease. So, but we've politicized this doctor who has a pretty well celebrated background in HIV, but because he became a federal employee, um, he was able to be politicized in this way. And that is like, again, across the spectrum. Like, that he's an example, but that happens a lot. Um, and I think that that's where mis and disinformation really thrive, is creating that sort of flattening for everybody. Like, everything is that good, bad, good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. And now I don't trust experts because we see that too with like pharmaceuticals. I am not the girl to cape for pharmaceutical like C-suite people. I think that profiting in the way that they like to profit off of medication is awful, but we need medication. I'm never going to sit here and say we have to destroy the pharmaceutical industry, because I want people to get chemotherapy, and I want people to get chemotherapy safely, because the pharmaceutical industry is also required to do things like stringently test to make sure your chemotherapy medications that are pumped right into your veins is sterile. You know, like, I don't I don't want that to go to like mom and pop shops. I just like, I want that to be a large enough, robust enough group to make medication. I want it to produce your insulin. I want it to make your, like your hypertension medication. Um, I don't want it to be profitable in the way that it's profitable, and I don't want it to be for profit. But I want you to have access to medication. I desperately want more people to have access to the medication that they require.
Yeah. I think that point is weaponized by people who peddle holistic remedies, because it's like, here's this mega corporation that's trying to basically keep you on drugs for the rest of your life. And then it's just like, here's this cure to this disease. Take it and you'll feel good.
And it's, yeah, and that thing is not regulated. That thing has not been tested for sterility. That thing has not been tested for like, what's it called? Contra interactions. Like, there's drug on drug interactions. There's drug on what is, gosh, not substance, drug on supplement interactions. Like, those things, like, someone who's, producing colloidal silver or like powdered cranberry supplements, they are not knowledgeable in these ways to know, like you could be harming yourself because you're also taking like what's called like PPIs, inhibitors for like your heartburn. and your supplement could interact with that in a way that could be harmful to you, that can be toxic or become poisonous. There's like all sorts of like phylokinetic, I think is the word, interactions that do kidney damage. Like, these things are very scary and they're very real, and you can do them with over-the-counter medication interactions if you're not careful. But we're taught to hate. And I know somebody's going to hear this, and be like, oh, this person's really caping for pharmaceuticals. I'm caping for safe procedures.
Yeah.
The day that your supplements get the kind of vigorous research that they deserve, and they are produced in a way that we know is safe and effective, is the day I will also include them. And there are some things where I'm like, it's harmless. I don't care. Like, there are people who are like, oh, you want to make tea with a lot of ginger and cinnamon and go for it. But my concern starts to be when people are being told, take this supplement that is produced in this non-transparent way instead of your chemo medication.
Yeah. It's like, on one level, there's natural remedies that you can take for minor illnesses like a cold or flu. But then it's like you're jumping the gun when you're looking up cures for cancer. It's like, drink hydrogen peroxide, take massive doses of colloidal silver. And it's like, you've well, this is the opposite, but in a way, you've Mayo Clinic'd your way into a treatment for something that is not regulated and dangerous. If you take a bunch of colloidal silver, your skin can turn silver or blue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And these things, the people who have sold you that $25 bottle of colloidal silver, they are going to benefit greatly. And you are going to get sick and possibly die. And that's really destructive. Now, the other people we can hold accountable here, the other groups we can hold accountable, going back to the pharmaceutical companies, is that for-profit model. The reason people are looking at $25 bottle worth of colloidal silver also has to do with the fact that their insulin is $300, $3,000. I think insulin, the cost, it's been capped recently, but like the cost of these things has been astronomical, especially without some sort of coverage, some sort of insurance coverage that has, prescriptions as part of it. And so people rationing their insulin is horrid. And then other really, I think, very predatory things, like, for example, with EpiPens, a friend of mine who's a health economist talks about this, but the way that you inject epinephrine for allergies, that is open source. The medication itself is an open source design. Anybody can produce it for like $5, right? I mean, in terms of like the cost of production.
Mm-hmm.
It's the actual pen that administers your medication that is trademarked and marked up. That's why they cost that much. Because somebody was like, oh, this pen design, I'm going to make it exclusive. And then nobody else can produce it. And then I'm going to mark up, because it's necessary, I'm going to mark it up. So EpiPens are $200, $300 a piece because of like trademark law, not because like it's hard to produce epinephrine. I think that we can have a great conversation about that. I want us to have that conversation, but misinformation and disinformation just wants us to hate everything, and in hating everything, move away from that industry entirely. And the money you can afford, which is like $25, they want to usurp that out of your pocket. So they're not even giving you anything. We can fight with a pharmaceutical company about markups and capping the price of things. We should be able to have those conversations about regulations. But instead, we're having, especially on social media, people who are telling us all of that industry is trying to kill you, trying to keep you on medication for life. I just want you to get well. Here's colloidal silver for $25, and everybody has $25, and that's the danger of it. Not everybody has $300 for an EpiPen, but I definitely have $25. And so it's even more insidious in my mind because you make it accessible. and it's it has no bearing in somebody's health.
And that's just in one subject, like
Mm-hmm.
the pharmaceuticals, or excuse me, like the pharmaceutical industry, like the medical field. They're trying to poison you. They're trying to kill you. But when you span out to other different institutions and then you give all of this rhetoric to all these people, it could easily incite violence overall.
Incite violence. It incites people to do things like, and this is where more and more I think it also affects governance, um, more than just politics, but actual governance, is that it incites people to then seek support from policy change with the wrong information. And now that we live in a time where, going back to that first question about one of the prior questions you had around virality, it's not just content creators who are being incentivized by virality. It's also our politicians. It's also our the people who are supposed to be policy and lawmakers are also incentivized by going viral. And so we're sort of not, we're living, Neil Postman talks about, we're living in a post-literate world. We're no longer living in a space where we have representatives who are doing things like standing up to a constituency and saying, hey, this is how this will hurt you because I want the best for you. I'm not going to advocate for this. And here's why. I'm going to be an educator about it. You know, we now have a lot of our representatives who, if something's popular enough, they'll pursue it. They'll pursue it even when it's dangerous. And so the best example I can give is like, I think it was Montana or one of the Dakotas. There was quite a few over the height of COVID states that were pursuing policy and legislation that would force pharmacists to just fill ivermectin prescriptions without counseling without counseling the patient on like contraindication or like not contraindications. I mean, drug on drug interactions. That is incredibly dangerous to say that, like, by law, by state law, you cannot tell someone or talk them out of this prescription. And if you remember, there was this group of people who have MDs who had made it very profitable for themselves to do like $100 telehealth visit with you and prescribe you ivermectin. So you could get a prescription for it. A pharmacist was sort of the last bastion stop for people for safety reasons to be like, hey, you don't need this. This is not going to do what you think it's going to do. And it's actually very dangerous because it could be destructive for you to take medication you don't need. And we use this as like an antifungal or antiviral or whatever. We don't even use it in this way. It's not approved in this way necessarily. This is an off-label prescription.
It was a horse dewormer, right?
Yeah, there's a version of it that's a horse dewormer. I think there's for ivermectin, and then hydroxychloroquine is used for like lupus, to treat lupus in a lot of ways. But there's another version of it that goes into like fish tanks. Like it's all, you know. But to have these state legislatures passing law that is like, oh, now the problem is your pharmacist is not filling this prescription because of their like educated knowledgeability that this is dangerous for you. Fine, we'll pass a law that says they can't counsel you and refuse to fill this. That is super dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, it takes a long time to explain, like, this is a virus, this is how viruses work, this is how to kill a virus and deal with this. These are people in these facilities trying to create a vaccine or trying to create a medicine for this specific treatment of COVID. But it's easy to peddle a cure in a moment where everybody's freaking out because there's a toilet paper shortage.
And there's an information vacuum. I think that's the other thing that I don't know if media has done this so much as, like, weirdly enough, the sort of consumer-centered capitalism that we sort of live under, which is like a sort of fast food design where if I need to be able to, we no longer have a good perception of time and what takes time, right? And
Mm-hmm.
science, no matter how good it gets, still takes time. A centrifuge is going to take how long a centrifuge takes to separate parts in a sample. Like it's just going to do that. And I think plenty of people who work in the sciences understand that time is part of good science. But people who are not in the sciences and people who don't deal in professions that require time live on a sort of a now model, right? Like I right now, without even cutting off this like podcast, I can climb in my car and I can drive somewhere and without, taking a break from my sentence, in the middle of my sentence, I can get food, I can get coffee, I can get without leaving my car, that sort of immediate ability to engage in satisfaction makes it very, very hard for people to understand something like a novel virus that is, like communicable and like how long it takes to like understand it. It takes enough time to like, first of all, learn how to test for it. And then in testing for it, testing enough people to get a sense of it. And like, but
Yeah.
so a lot of people lived in a information vacuum where they insisted they needed to know what was going on when science was like, we want to be sure, we want to have a 99 percentile report to you, give us time. And people's answer was like, then you don't know. And misinformation and disinformation really like bite down on that, like, oh, people want an answer, I have an answer immediately.
To add to what you said, it seems like in the information age, getting information started as like a sit down restaurant where you had to take your order and then you got all the, in this case, documents. You would go to a library, talk with a librarian, sit down and look it up yourself. And then with the advent of the internet, social media, it's like immediate access, Google, bing, bang, boom. If I need to study for or write a paper, here's Google Scholar, here's my university's library. But at the same time, within that search engine, if I look up this particular topic, what matters is the top page. And what could possibly be on that page? What are the keywords that are going to push that to the top? And it feels like people are fighting for that spot to be, if not the top result, on that first page.
Yeah. And it's also why people kind of have a false understanding of what an expert, people don't understand the difference now between what an expert knows and how they know it, and they're Googling. And I actually understand why. I totally understand why. I think a lot of experts are a bit snobby about this. And I also understand why with that. Like, as someone who has, an undergraduate degree and a graduate degree, you are run through the gauntlet, especially in graduate school. You like, there's no breaks, no pumping it. Like you are run through a gauntlet. If you are wrong, you are told you are wrong. If you don't do a good job, you're told to do it again. Like if you misinterpret a text, you are told that is not a good interpretation and sent back to the desk. Like you are. There's a lot of accountability and stress testing what while you're also stuffing yourself with information. And a lot of people don't realize that like it's not just about what I learned, it's about where I learned it, it's about who cultivated and like guided me through the learning process, it's about how I reflected on it, it's about stress testing my knowledge repeatedly at different intervals to make sure that I understood things correctly and I used the right like quality resources. A lot of people don't know all that, so they think that they're Googling because the false idea, the false belief is that, well, everything's on Google, I can just Google it.
Yeah.
And so I can know what you know, I just have to Google it. And it's like not that simple because again, Google is not, there's no accountability. Google's just throwing stuff, whatever gets thrown onto the internet, the Google curates and pulls up for your search. And it's also leaning into its own algorithm of like showing you what you prefer, not what is best. And also, are you gonna, if you Google something and the first thing that comes up is, the Disability Bioethics Reader, which is a $67 book that has 400 pages in it, is that the one you're going to read first? No. But that's the one that has it. That's the one you're supposed to. That's the one I had to.
Yeah.
Um, so there's that false equivalency of like, I can get to the information immediately, so I'm just as good as you, the expert. And that's sort of the dangerous element too. And again, misinformation and disinformation teach us that.
There's that competitiveness element, which is
It's
like, I
competitive.
proved you wrong, source question mark in the comment.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that challenging constantly. I think, and disinformation loves to make us feel confident. I feel less confident as a bioethicist now, years past having graduated, than I did going into my first two classes. Like my first two, like bioethics 1 and 2 classes. I felt very confident in those classes. But as I went through the education and the reflection and producing papers and getting A's and getting told to do it again, and I feel less, and then realizing how much information's out there to know, I feel my least confident. And I think a lot of people interpret that lack of confidence to mean lack of knowledgeability.
Yeah.
I'm not lacking in knowledgeability. I'm just hyper aware of how much there is to know. And so I'm also hyper aware that I could have gotten something a little wrong. I could have conflated something. I could have mixed two data points up because it's been a long day. Like I am always aware of how I could have kind of messed it up.
It seems like social media amplifies the Dunning-Kruger effect because it rewards stubbornness and arrogance.
Yeah, and dramatics. And we participate in that too, because social media also is an unforgiving place to live. We don't let people make a mistake.
Yeah.
We don't
You
let
get
people
bullied.
you get bullied. And when I say make a mistake, I even mean small ones. One of the hardest things about saying I'm a bioethicist and using the word ethicist in my title is that if people perceive something that I've said as a little wrong, their favorite line, God, you could probably go through every one of my videos and find at least one comment that does this, which is, that's not very ethical, or that you're not being very, like, the other one is like, you're passing along misinformation or disinformation because you said that, you said this, but actually it's this, which is like sort of a technicality, or like sometimes people don't realize they preferred that something was said the way they like to hear it said, not that I said something wrong. But those are the two comments that I see a lot of the time, which is, as soon as they perceive that like something was done a little wrong, it's like, you're not ethical, or like, you dabble in disinformation too. And I'm like, I'm a human making a video at 1 a.m. for free on a child's dancing app,
Yeah.
like,
It's weird how the amount of projection has increased. Because people will be the first to accuse you of peddling misinformation, yet you go on their account and what are they peddling? Misinformation.
there's a difference between a mistake that is perceivable and being completely wrong, right? Like, the other day, if I said that something happened in 1871 and it actually happened in 1869, that is a mistake. that
Yeah.
that is not misinformation or disinformation. They are two different years, and they had two different things occur. But when we're talking about history, I wasn't correct, but the mistake is consumably understandable, and it doesn't augment the information
Yeah.
in a detrimental way. There's a vast difference between making that sort of mistake and then something like, being like, oh, horses have 3 legs. That is wrong. Horses definitely have 4
Yeah.
in most instances.
I mean, you're a content creator making a video, not a person trying to make a textbook.
And I tell people all the time, the content on my TikTok is going to be the rawest way that I give information. I encourage people, and remember too, there's a time constraint. There's 10 minutes that I have or less to get a whole idea or thought or story or concept into. And I'm also not able to use a lot of the academic language that is the language you would usually use for things. So in trying to simplify it, I may have to define multiple things. And so it's very limited. I encourage people all the time. I'm like, if you want me to if you want more accurate information, and when I say accurate, I mean more mistake. If you want information that is missing its mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
I encourage you to go to the conferences I present at, because for that, first of all, I get an hour to 2 hours and like 90 minutes on average to present at a conference. I get to have slides that people are paying attention to. I get to spend, a lot of conferences give you months to prepare a presentation. This is a social media app. And in order to stay relevant, I sort of have to make content that also relates to things that are trending. Things only trend for 48 to 72 hours.
Yeah.
So you're getting material that is not incorrect. I don't post things if I'm like, ooh, that was like deeply wrong. As far as I know. But like, yeah, there's going to be a mistake. And I try to catch it also before I post things, when I'm in the editing phase. You'll frequently see on my videos that I'll have like purple pop-ups where I either contextualize something more or I correct something like, oh, it wasn't 1871, it was 1869. Like I make sure that I show those corrections when I catch them. So by the time something's on my TikTok and it's content, I feel very confident that I have addressed any mistakes the best that I can, making content sitting in my bedroom in between living a whole life,
Yeah.
But I do want people, like, if you want it to be better or cleaner, or if you need it to meet these standards, definitely go to a conference where I present, like totally like be in that space. Like, fund me making long form content. The kind of content that I think sometimes with perfectionism that people are desirous of, it costs money and I'm not paid to do this.
Yeah. I think that, I guess here's another lens of how we got here. I think there's been a decline in attention span overall, especially after social media was introduced. Because I saw a video one time where this one guy made a point that shows like Coco Melon have everything moving, and there's no direction, there's no guidance. It's just like wheels on the bus go round and round, but there is so much stimulus that's taken in by the child viewing this, versus a show like Sesame Street or Blue's Clues, which has a child psychologist working with the people making it, that give guidance and directions and allow smooth movement, directed movement, so that way there is easy learning on specific things that they're trying to show in the themes. I think that, I don't know when Cocomelon was released, like what year, but I feel like this plus YouTube Kids plus, I think it's on Netflix now, but all of these given to the iPad generation is probably going to make the issue 10 times worse if there's no like redirection, if there's no attention capture in a efficient enough way. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I think media being, again, going back to that entertainment element and without more checks and balances. I mean, that's sort of the letdown of like these YouTube shows that, again, like what you just said, like Sesame Street is funded by PBS. Like that is like funded by the American like populace. Like it's got federal funding behind it. So it's held to certain standards. And Sesame Street is such a great example because it was designed to be a childhood educational, like pre-kindergarten educational tool for lower income families and households, because they couldn't afford to send kids to things like pre-K or like daycare necessarily. They might have family members taking, and so the concept of Sesame Street and the history of it was designed to be truly informational media for children to consume through their TVs. Is amazing. I forget the documentary that was made about just the thought that goes into to Sesame Street, including child psychologists, um, and other designers, other folks who did like design, like sociologists who did research on children and children stimulus, and all of these things were brought in to make this thing, so that's why it's timeless too. You could show Sesame Street to 4 different generations and they're all nostalgic about it. But living in the YouTube era, I, again, single person, nobody holding me accountable, with $100 worth of materials I can get off of, Amazon. I can make a child's show that could become incredibly popular, and it has no functional, like, base design meant to be educational. It's entertaining, it's interesting, but it has none of those elements underlyingly in it, like Sesame Street does. And for people who are at home placing their children in front of a screen, they don't know that difference. They don't know that Sesame Street is designed like that, and that like Cocomelon is not. They don't. They just know that their child likes it, um, and that's really harmful. I think the other thing that is really harmful is the way we have made education so competitive, especially like collegiate education, that has trickled down and really affected high school and middle school and even elementary school education in a way that has caused people to stop, especially children. We've stopped encouraging children to do things like read a book end to end, for enjoyment, or just like for the exercise and building the strength of like focus. And then also we haven't, when we're not teaching children to read a book end to end, we're also not asking them to examine the book. So I think comprehension has also suffered. Uh, I say this all the time. I was talking to friends the other day, about book talk, and one of my friends was lamenting the fact that, um, there was some chaos on book talk where a couple of people said they don't want book talk to be political, and other people were sort of like horrified at that statement. And people were like, reading is political inherently because there are some groups who were not allowed to read. Um, but they were like, how can people think that reading's not political, or reading doesn't have like just the act of reading itself even? And my answer was, it's because they're engaging with books the way you engage with anything else, like Stanley Cups, that it's consumption.
Mm-hmm.
These folks aren't reading these like sci-fi fantasy novels and having a reflection or like critical thinking exercise with it, or like comprehension. They're in it for consumption. So even with people who are reading now, the focus is on how many books can I read in the year, how many books can I have, how many collections or how many authors can I know all their works by, but there's no critical thinking. It's like, what do you do in those instances when people are reading for the sake of consumption?
That's a hard one, because it's like there's a lot of themes in a lot of the fiction books, like Star Wars, like Dune, and people have these political analyses of like Paul Atreides, or the Empire itself, what inspired George Lucas to create the Empire. But at the same time, if you're trying to make your goal of like, oh, here's 10 books in a year, like it's not going to help you. It's not what you do, it's why you do it.
Right. Right. So I think these two things mashed up is like media designing itself to be less and less anything other than brain candy, essentially, or eye candy, not even brain candy. And then the way we've designed education, which is we're not asking people to be reflective or like have critical thought around what they're, there's a lot of focus on rote memorization or like consumption, like just, you know, like read this and then on to the next. There's no stop and sit with and unpack. That's why I love book clubs, because it
Yeah.
forces people to be like, oh, I didn't see that. I didn't realize this was allegorical,
Yeah. I think that I think that the education system has made people hate learning in general,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like I'm trying to study for a test. Oh yeah, we got to take the entrance exams provided by the state. Okay, here's a bunch of information. Take the test. Great. Congratulations. I think, what is it, like half the curriculum now is dedicated off of the test in some instances.
Mm-hmm.
I think another element of it, especially in elementary school, recess and
Mm.
play, the importance of play. Because if you're going to, have kids sit for 7.5 hours a day, you need to allow them to develop their vestibular system by playing on recess. But if you set all the rules and don't allow them to set their own limits and terms, I think that could affect their development as well. Because on
Yeah.
the playground, they have to learn, like, here's what a social relationship is, here's how my actions have consequences. But if it's like, here's the allowable games, these aren't the allowable games, you're conditioning them to appeal to authority in a way.
Or even things like I was reading a lot. I was reading, and then there was like an article or something I was consuming the other day about home ec, right? Like people in my age range, or depending on how old, because it's really, really thinly sliced. Like I received a home ec class. I was probably one of the last groups of folks who received a home ec class. And I received a home ec class in like first grade, where we are, 6, 7 years old. And as a group, or as little groups of like 2 and 3 kids, we are learning to do things like bake bread. And this is such a great, the loss of, or like wood shops, another example that you don't see too
Yeah.
often.
Working
These
with
are
your
actually
hands.
working with your hands. It's that going back to the what you were just saying with play is such a necessary tool for learning. And I think of my sister is one of my favorite examples, because she really had such a tough time in high school with high school core curriculum items. She's a very creative minded person. She's a enormously talented piano player. I don't know to this day why she doesn't play piano like professionally. Um, she just has a mind for things like music, and she loves animals, and she just wasn't geared to things like mathematics and like chemistry, right? And I mean, my parents did everything that they could to just sort of eke her through those classes. I mean, she had tutors, she had all sorts of things. Well, as an adult, um, she was diagnosed, as runs in our family, with so I think it's like depression 2 or whatever. Um, and she had started to take up making skin and hair care products and soap. And she sat and on her own, I mean, with talking to other professionals and talking to people, and like obviously when I say on her own, she was on a fact-finding journey, but she definitely sought the counsel of professionals and people who were experts. She started to not just make soap, like melt down soap and make melt and pores, which is the easiest way
Mm-hmm.
you can make soap. She actually started to like chemically devise soap, to the point now where she can tell you the different ratios of fats she'll need depending on the type of fats to make the type of soap you might want. So there's a different type of fat content if you use like mango butter versus like avocado oil versus like olive oil versus like beef tallow. Like it is amazing, but everything she's doing is chemistry.
Yeah.
And a class like home ec would have strengthened her ability to be successful in chemistry, but also would have taught her that she can be a chemist. The chemistry that she would want to be doing has to be functional for her. And so the loss of things like play, or the loss of things like teaching children like um, functional skills and tools, like making cookies is chemistry. It makes it so yeah, like you said, people hate learning, because I too hated a chemistry class. It didn't make sense to me. Cookies make sense to me. Baked goods make sense to me. When you tell me like, oh, an egg is an emulsifier, it's what holds it together. That's a form of chemistry, but I need that, because I don't just consume the science of chemistry through numbers and like blank white paper.
Mm-hmm.
So I can see why people, like you're saying, like they hate learning, because learning is so stale and it doesn't apply to our lives.
I think like you said, it's like learning indirectly. You can
Mm-hmm.
make these associations without actually learning about the key concepts and terminology. But I
Mm-hmm.
think the way that we view learning or view education in general is like high school is the most important, elementary school is the least important. But it's like it's actually the reverse, because if you condition kids to like learning, have critical thinking, have reading comprehension, their improvement on subjects across the board along their educational journey is going to be significantly easier. But
Yeah.
if you push and pedal tests the whole time and force them to sit down for 7.5 hours, and it's like, oh, cool, here's a 30-minute break. You can only play these games. You can't play tag. It's like you're just setting them up for failure in a way.
And that the other thing I will say too is that people don't are now sort of anti-intellectualism or anti-learning, because they think it's boring, they think it's not, or they think it's so stale or stiff, or it doesn't apply to their lives. The other thing that's super important is that, like, understanding process, right? Like, what's great about learning, like understanding or learning something like chemistry through baking chocolate chip cookies, is that the process of reading and understanding the percentages and the ratios of your ingredients and how you mix them together, all of that has a bore level to it, right? But if you commit yourself, if you really invest and pay attention, the outcome of this is chocolate chip cookies.
Yeah.
Like, the goal can be, you can have an entertaining or rewarding goal. And so I think we also need to, it's about striking that balance of like, learning it can be hard, but also we have to meet with like these goals, these things that are at the end of it, you know what I mean, that are really, really great things that we all make our lives better. Chocolate chip cookies makes all of our lives better. Like,
Yeah.
it's that too. I think there's an American culture, revisiting that point about feeling like I need to be entertained. It My learning can still be boring, and that's okay too, because when you know something, when you come out on the other end, there is great reward to it, and that is self-actualization, that is being more empathetic, being more present with other people, understanding people better, understanding our world better, being better at managing our money. Like, all of these things are the outcomes that are super great and have a chocolate chip cookie edge to them. Um, so, and then, but all of this is about the balance, right? It's about the,
Yeah.
like, play is learning, but also like, we don't have relatability too, relatability of information, and making us have the stomach or building up the strength of character to also be able to sit and learn and not become resentful.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And we went over how we got here in many different ways, but how do you combat misinformation? So one thing that I have here is freedom of speech versus accountability, because when you peddle misinformation or disinformation, the first thing is, well, freedom of speech, my First Amendment right.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to, well, the first challenge I always ask people with when they're like freedom of speech, or freedom of anything, is there is this very necessary conceptualization of freedom, which is freedom from and freedom to, right? And a lot of people don't understand the conceptualization of freedom from and freedom to, which is why they think that they should just be free. Freedom means to just be like, just doing what I want, silly, goofy mood. You know, if I want to yell in a Starbucks, I can. Like, that is not. So, like, you have, like, for example, if you and I go to a restaurant and I want to chain smoke while I eat a steak, you have the freedom from experiencing cigarette smoke. Like that,
Mm-hmm.
I have the freedom to smoke. So nobody's going to stop me from smoking, but you also have the freedom from smoke, from being exposed to carcinogenic um, smoke from cigarettes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially secondhand, which is the more dangerous version because there's no filter. So when I'm told I have to smoke outside, a lot of people are like, this is affecting my freedom. And it's not affecting your freedom. You're infringing on others people's freedom from. Because I, as a single person who wants to smoke, have a right to smoke. But when we're talking about issues where everybody in the restaurant is now smoking when I smoke, or everybody in the restaurant is now enduring the dangers, the health concerns and dangers related to smoking because I want to smoke. That is when we're infringing on freedom from. So you have freedom to up until freedom from. And I just wish we taught that better because I feel like a lot more people would get it. Like you have the freedom to swing your fist all the way around you as much as you want up until the point that you are within range of someone's face. And then it's freedom from. They have the freedom from being injured by you swinging your fist. And so I start that by saying, when it comes to freedom of speech, I think we don't have, I think your point about accountability is people don't understand the accountability portion of that. And that's the freedom from. I personally don't think, philosophically speaking, subjectively speaking, I don't think that mis and disinformation fall under freedom to. I think that they really encroach on freedom from. And because of that, I don't see a problem with there being some sort of regulatory procedures related to it. Now, do I think we should lock up people who are posting disinformation on the internet? No, that's a freedom to conversation. That is your freedom of speech, right? But that accountability piece, maybe the question becomes, platforms cannot keep their like, maybe we have like regulation that fines platforms for distribution or allowing for distribution, right? Maybe we don't allow for platforms to have, or we are able to, dismantle or fine a platform that is a bastion of place where people are promoting and producing and distributing disinformation. That's a regulatory conversation, and that's a freedom from, because I think all of us have the freedom from being misled in a way that's dangerous to our health. And also endangers people like experts. I mean, we're not just talking about disinformation, misinformation, and disinformation. A lot of people are like, well, if they want to drink raw milk, let them drink raw milk. But it's not that simple, because people drinking raw milk produce micro the microbiology that they're consuming. They produce things like the bacteria or the viruses that they're consuming show up in things like their stool, which overproduces in waste plants, which overproduces in our society. That's cholera. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So we all have the right to freedom from being sick because my neighbor decided to chug raw milk. And in chugging raw milk, it has made them have like a diarrheal effect that has caused everybody on the block to get norovirus. And one of those people on the block is a newborn who is susceptible to the mortality results of having diarrhea. That's So who taught my neighbor to chug raw milk? If it's an individual, they should be fined or they should be held accountable in some way because they're endangering people. We're endangering people's mental health too, because people, like I wrote about in my thesis, this is causing great emotional and like psychological distress to people. People are becoming agitated. People are developing like it really does have an effect compoundingly on people's mental health in a way that has some permanency. Or takes quite a bit of professional intervention to like unravel and unpack, but we still haven't even seen what that looks like really. So combating it, I think we have to get stronger stomachs around the idea of not seeing disinformation and misinformation simply as speech, but as distribution of resource or distribution of information. And we have plenty of regulations and accountability measures for those things. You can't just publish any research you see fit in any one of these journals. There's accountability measures. You can have your license revoked for passing along the wrong information destructively as a doctor or a lawyer if you're not practicing in good faith. We can hold things accountable for distribution or creation. What that looks like is I don't think it's carceral for individuals, but I think we have to have something. And there's been plenty of suggestions across a lot of different groups. And in the minor, like the ways that I combat it is usually what's called pre-bunking. It's really hard to debunk disinformation. It's really hard to take something from somebody. We know that just with infants, you know. I would encourage people to distribute the right information as soon as they can, as best they can, to the people they love and care about. And the other thing that's really hard to say in these very polarized times is not leaving people alone. People often ask me, why do people consume disinformation? Why do they become conspiracy theorists? I did 2 years of like meta-analysis and research consumption around this, and the answer is painfully simple, unfortunately, and it's loneliness is one of the key reasons. And so it doesn't surprise me that during one of our loneliest times, which was people being trapped in the house because that people became incredibly lonely, and in becoming incredibly lonely, they started to, and anxious, that's the other one, they started to consume information in the spaces that they knew that they could find community. Conspiracy theorists are in a community. It's not just ideology. Like those are the people that love and care for them, they think. And so we really can't leave people alone. There's plenty of people that are going to tell me, I have to cut my parents off because they're jerks to me. You know, like I hear all that. I'm not telling people to endure abuse, but we really, isolating people doesn't work. What seems to happen with isolation is people devolve emotionally and mentally in these spaces. And so when you give people a trusted community, it's easier to hold them accountable. And this is in a real life, stepping off social media. I think that's the other thing too, is social media tends to give us the advice, simplified advice that's like, if these people are terrible to you, cut them off, you know? But actually, or, you know, like, you didn't like that guy, you don't like that boyfriend anymore, stop talking to him, you know, like your sibling and you argue sometimes, you don't need to deal with them. Like, we're sort of very much like isolate people. I think isolate bad actors, like creators of disinformation, but the people who consume it they're lonely. And if they don't have community, the sad thing is that we make community wherever we can. Humans will do this very interesting thing, which is we have to eat, we have to sleep, and we have to be in community. And so we will make a bed anywhere. We will eat whatever we can. and we will grow close to anything that will listen. And when you're talking about someone who's in the depths of these things, in the same way that people will eat grass if their stomach is empty, this is they will go headfirst into conspiratorial spaces or cults or whatever, to find love, adoration, and support in community.
Yeah. People will go to almost any length to feel like they can belong to something.
Absolutely.
And at least in the beginning, with Twitter cracking down on misinformation and hate speech, those people who were banned just went somewhere else, and then people on Twitter pushed them to those underground communities as well. As long as other internet, or as well as other internet forums, on
Mm-hmm.
top of that, I think there need to be levels to like what accountability is.
Mm-hmm.
Because on one hand, you have the content creators pushing the misinformation and disinformation, while at the same time you have other content creators combating that disinformation
Mm-hmm.
for you. But if you have a bot that looks at the videos and it's like, here's this misinformation, here's this misinformation, bam, both people are going to get equally punished. So
Yeah.
you might want to have some human in the loop system where a person can clearly, like, who's like nonpartisan, can look at this and say, okay, this person is peddling misinformation. This person is trying to debunk this to make sure that that misinformation doesn't spread. So I'm going to reduce the amount of exposure for the person peddling and try to increase the amount of exposure debunking.
Yeah.
So at least you can make an algorithm go in a more positive direction for society at large.
Yeah. Or give people, I guess, give people more voting options rather than like or dislike too. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
we have the option to like report things, but reporting something isn't the same as like giving us the tools as the audience to like better label something that can trigger like a human interaction with the content. I think the problem too is like these companies are taking on, I think, way too big of like a cache of like raw data, raw anything. I mean, people are uploading to YouTube or uploading to TikTok or uploading to Facebook like hundreds of thousands of times per minute, like,
Yeah.
and they're already struggling to take down some of the more virulent, terrible content that is truly absolute violence and disgusting and horror inducing. And so they don't even really have the time to deal with things that are injurious over the long term. And I also think that they could empower larger creators more to like be participants or arbiters of that. I often wonder, because like this is my specialization, and when I go to somebody's, like, I saw a post earlier today that was clearly someone who was being paid by like a competitor who had made a video talking about, I forget what the product was, but it was disinformation, and it had the little paid partnership thing at the bottom. And I was like, oh, so this is about them pushing this thing that they're trying to sell that's like beef tallow based, right? And I reported it, and I was like, this is misinformation, because the first part of this video before she gets to the cell is making people distrust like regular shampoo and like body wash, which is like not good.
Mm-hmm.
And in sending in that report, somewhere around an hour later, I get a thing back that's like, oh, no violation found. And I'm like, of all people that knows there's a violation is me. And I'm a larger scale creator, so I'm not really sure what my reporting does. I'm not saying that like people with a larger following should be the most trusted source, but what I'm saying is like we can be utilized as more than content creators. We can also be utilized as in a way for moderation, but it means we might need more weight behind us. We need more power. Because ultimately what happens is that instead of someone like me who has, I'm verifiable, you can look into my background, I can send you, whatever you need to prove that I should be trusted with a little more access power or whatever. But if we're just going off of volume, people who have access to bot farms can have taken, I've seen plenty of creators who were like medical professionals have their very important content taken down simply because a bot farm was able to mass report it. And
Mm.
what triggered the content coming down wasn't because the content, there was a problem with the content. It was because somebody else had the strength to build a bot farm and take it down with numbers. And so that's not a good design either. But like you have plenty of really great medical creators on this app who would more than love while they're scrolling to like indicate like this isn't good content. Like this should be, but you also have to imbue them with a little more trust to say like, oh, like this person knows what they're talking about. So when they mark something as medical misinformation, that should be some sort of like highlighting component or flag. You know what I mean? These are all suggestions, and I don't ever want us to think that like we have to take these, what I say, you know, full package. Sometimes when you give people like suggestions of how to combat these things, people are like, yeah, but that wouldn't work because of, and we sort of suffer the sin of like not doing any good because we're trying to get perfect or great. But we have to endeavor something. Um, I will also tell people interpersonally, you can realign people's algorithms. Sometimes people are consuming disinformation because they started off really liking baking videos and they ended up on tradwife content. You know, there is some
Yeah.
content that is really entry level, like there's really like a the gateway essentially uh to more visceral and cruel and dangerous content. Um And so what you might have to do is maybe not talk to them as much as you'd like to talk to them directly about their issue. But like for one woman who came to me and was talking about her mom was like consuming all of this really terrible content on YouTube. I said, well, what do you and your mom have in common? And she was like, oh, we really love like black hair care and, you know, and like, you know, like nail like art videos and stuff. And I was like, send her that stuff. If you continue to send it to her and she continues to open it, first of all, she's looking at stuff that she likes and it's innocuous. That's great. But it'll actually change her algorithm over time because she's watching it all the way through. Uh, these platforms usually are not, they don't differentiate between you watching something someone sent you all the way through and you having organically stumbled on something. And so you can actually shift her algorithm for her by, it just means she'll be watching a lot more braiding videos, but like great, you know?
Yeah. It's usually the social relationships that a person has in their personal life that can get them out of that echo chamber.
Exactly. Exactly. And even like that, like I said, that sneakily, I mean, like my wife loves like salad videos. I don't know what that is. She loves cooking videos, but they're always salads. And she'll send them to me. Inevitably, if she sends me enough of them in a row and either by text or like DMing them to me on the platform, I end up getting a ton of salad content. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you can also participate by just connecting and gently redirecting the actual algorithm that is drawing those people to engage with that content. But it means that you just have to consistently send them, and I mean very placid content. Don't send them the stuff that's like the stuff you're consuming is misinformation because
Yeah.
that's polarizing and like that's activating. Send them salads. It sounds silly, but like send them send them like baby otter videos. You know, like
Yeah.
that stuff really, yeah.
It'll just reaffirm their position if you do that.
To what do you mean to
No, like sending them like this is misinformation, it's just going to reaffirm their position on that.
exactly. They kind of become defensive and bite down. But if you start to send them baby otter videos, at minimum you're cleansing their timeline in a way where they
Mhm.
emotionally can better receive the conversation because disinformation protects itself by making people agitated too and prepping people to be told they're wrong, and people don't respond well to that. So
Yeah.
they're prepared to defend themselves already with that.
Are there any simple philosophical concepts to gauge the merit of a claim?
What do you mean?
So, like Occam's razor, for example, the claim that carries the least assumptions is usually the one that's correct. Little things like that.
Mm, I yeah, I mean, like, sure, like Occam's razor is always like, I think is the one that comes up a lot, and I would agree with it being the most functional premise. It's like there's Plato's cave a little bit, like how we see things as they are if we don't turn around and look, or we're not able to. Um, but I think mostly the thing that I want people to understand is like things are complex in really dynamic and interesting ways. They're frequently not complex in a way that is malicious. And so what I mean by that is like using the pharmaceutical example again. Pharmaceuticals are expensive. They're expensive because C-suite executives make the most money, and stakeholders and stockholders as well. They benefit off of that being a for-profit model. No, there's too many people in the pharmaceutical industry to keep the secret that they're like secretly trying to keep you sick on medication. You know, the simple answer is greed, and it's the right answer. Um, it also, when you look at it and say, okay, well, if the answer is greed in the for-profit model, then it also means that you're able to look at who's getting wealthy off of this. It's not the bioengineers working on your cancer drugs who got into bioengineering because they had a sibling die of a glioblastoma and they really want to work on finding a cure for glioblastomas. It's not that guy. It's not that guy that went to get a PhD in that for 4 to 7 years and spent 4 to 7 years of his adult life or her adult life learning about glioblastomas and the cellular quality and structure and doing all that reading and having failed, research experiments in labs, all to come out and make $120,000 a year when they have, who knows how much debt and student loans. Like that person, that person's not frequently the one. They're not going to be able to keep that secret. That secret's too big. And it doesn't benefit them. I mean, $120,000 is a lot of money, but it's not enough to keep a global secret like we're trying to keep everybody sick,
Yeah.
I think that's like helping people understand that if your reasoning is complicated and the process of that is simple, then it's probably wrong. So if I'm like, well, it's because the global elites want us to all get sick, so we take medication for the rest of our lives, and in taking medication for the rest of our lives, they're able to like sell us all sorts of things for mind control. Like, that's too complicated. That being the impetus or the goal is you made already, that's too complicated. And then when you ask like, well, how are they doing that? They're like, by making sure that we all get prescribed more drugs. See how the system was too simple? It's in reality, the world works in the opposite way, which is most people are driven by, altruism or greed or empathy or a few combinations therein. And the system is the thing that's usually pretty complicated, which makes it hard to navigate, which is why we all struggle. That's probably something that's more attuned with what's right.
Fair enough. Any unique ways to efficiently dissect information in general?
Resourcing. And it's okay to not know a good resource. One of the things that I found that I find very fascinating is that a lot of disinformation creators, especially ones that have their own websites and talk about and they do a lot of what I call like junk filling, in the way that like you've never read a Chipotle bag because it's just too much on it. You know,
Mm.
you've never read a Dr. Bronner's label. It's too much happening on it. They sort of like to do that with their reference section of things. So if you ever go to their websites and they're like, "Oh, read these articles," and like there's like all these articles with these links, and nobody's doing that, right? They know nobody's doing it. But if you actually do click on it, if you actually have the time, what you'll see is a closed loop of resourcing and referencing. And so, if you have an account, if you have a web page and I have a web page, you might do a bunch of like blog writing or like writing articles that are may or may not be published. They could just be self-published. That's the other thing. And then on my website, I might reference all of your resources that you've self-published and you've put. But on your website, you might reference the resources I've created referencing your writing that were self-published resources. So that's what I mean by a closed resource loop. And so if you actually look at the resources on our websites, you'll see that there's nobody else referenced. The other thing that they'll do is they'll cherry pick information. And so one of the things that you always want to be careful of is small sample sizes. That's a basic statistics concept of like the larger your sample size, the closer to a percentile of confidence, right? So you want to see a sample size in anybody's resource material that's like 2,000 people, right? 3,000 people. That's at least a 95% confidence rate. But if you're seeing people using research papers, again, that self-publishing element is in there, and the sample size is 12. And that doesn't tell us anything. So be on the lookout for sample sizes, self-publishing especially, and then closed loop resources. It's a very weird thing to see that. But they write these like pseudo-scientific articles that have like bibliographies at the end, and all of the resources that they cite, all their citations are one another. It's like this audit. I mean, but I see why they do it, because who's going through that? You see for an average person, you see what looks like a professional research paper posted on their site, and you're like, okay, that's legit.
If you had to, sorry, my friend texted me, and then if you heard that, so I was like, I had to quickly answer because he was calling me, and I was like, I'm on an episode. If you had to sum up everything that we've talked about, key themes, lessons, what would they be?
I even though I don't always see it around my house, I do think that I am a cautious optimist. I think the biggest takeaway I always want people to have when it comes to mis and disinformation is that the silver lining of it is that people want to know things. People don't want to not know things. We do have an issue with anti-intellectualism in American culture, but that's mainly rooted in the fact that a lot of people are pretty resentful that they don't know things in the same way that a lot of people who have had the privilege and access to information, particularly information like school, like formal spaces of information acquirement, people feel left out, and that's why they're lonely, and they want to know things, and they feel like they deserve to know and be smart and contribute to the conversation too. And so sometimes I wonder, is a lot of what we're suffering because we sort of really neglect sharing? I would say this is my challenge for academics. Share more and share in a way that people can consume it. I understand we all paid for what we know, but we don't have to make everybody else pay. So share more. Share what you know more. Give it away. Like, I tell people all the time, ask me anything. You can have it. I'm so glad to have read that book for you. So you don't, especially if you're not a strong reader, let me help you. Please, like, take it from me and use it for something positive in the world. People want to know. And so I think if we got better at sharing and not making education and information cost prohibitive and elitist, um, I think our world would be a much better place. Uh, that's definitely a big takeaway. And I think that I don't think we're at the end. I don't think we're like, you know, going back to that like dystopian core like content that people are making. I'm not. I think it's going to get tough. I think it's going to get hard. I think it's going to be difficult. I think we're definitely in a bit of a spiral. And again, I say that about all sides of a political ideology and stream. They're just unique challenges on all sides. But we have to get better at being kinder and sharing. Not just like telling, finger wagging. I know what's best for all of us, you know. Yeah, a big part of being human is rest and joy. And I think a lot of folks are not experiencing either. And I desperately want to see more people who are rested and joyful. I think we'd all come together much better in that sense.
I think that if you enhance your social relationships, a lot of these issues slowly solve themselves.
Mm-hmm. And in the conditions that people are in. It's why I really love health and medicine. I love health and medicine humanities because I love seeing the conditions of people's lives improve. Um, I mean, there's nothing I love more than seeing someone say, you know, you gave me the idea or empowered me to ask my physician about this. You made me feel that I could, you know, I should go in and see my dentist and not let them like tell me who I am. You helped me think critically around, you know, whether or not I want to get this, you know, to give up smoking or whatever it is. You know, like I love hearing that people's lives have um, improved or done better, or they've gotten more access, or they just felt more comfortable to ask questions and learn more. Um, so yeah, the like you said, the better we are into to each other in society, I think the better people feel confident to be better. That's great.
Future plans and ambitions for your TikTok?
Oh, I never know. I mean, it depends on if it survives. I have a sneaking suspicion it'll probably survive past January. There's a lot of doomerism around that, but it would be such a historic precedent, and I just don't see that actually banning it is going to be a thing. I'm open to being wrong, but it's just so in making plans for it, I don't frequently plan for it. I have been asked repeatedly to make more long form content, so maybe one day I'll do something more curated and thoughtful, like a series on YouTube. But I'm not sure. I'd love to make the space and time for it, but you of all people, I don't have to tell you about like the amount of background and setup that has to go into it on top of the life you're living as an individual in the world.
It's like full-time utility lawn locator, full-time college student, then this.
Exactly.
So it's hell.
Exactly. You're like every day you're like, do I give this up? Do I stop doing it? Yeah, I would love to find a way that makes sense to be more sharing more other than just like, oh, got a good idea here, I'll make a TikTok video. But I also have to I would need to figure out what that looks like in terms of like that's beyond my realm. I would probably need help, you know. and I haven't gotten that far into like hiring and starting to think critically around like helping grow it out, like adding a team of something of people to it or something. But yeah, so I'll just keep posting until I have a better sense.
True. And where can people go to find you?
They can go to TikTok at Evan the Bioethicist. That is my only platform right now. I do not haunt the Twitter. I never have really. Please do not look for me there. I am not there on purpose. And I have an Instagram, but it is defunct. I feel so bad because I still get like notifications where it's like, so and so wants to follow you. And I'm like, I haven't posted on that since 2019. There's nothing to follow on there. So if you see me on Instagram, I love that you found it. It's privated because I literally just used to be a regular person. So TikTok is my only space. And if you want to preemptively follow my YouTube, I do have the same handle on YouTube. It's not populated right now, but for the day that it becomes populated, should I do it, it is there.
Gotcha. This has been a great conversation, Evan. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Bye.